Hi, everyone. This is Pratt Futures, and welcome to our second out of three collected conversations of this semester. My name is Sydney. I am one of Pratt Futures coordinator, and we always like to start off with a land acknowledgement before we do any of our lectures. This land acknowledgement, thank you to our future cohort, Ekam Singh, who'll be taking over Pratt Futures next semester. And so the living acknowledgement is Pratt Institute is situated on Lenape-Hoking, the traditional and unceded homeland of the Lenape people, past, present, and future. The Lenape people have been living on this land long before the United States was established, and their wisdom is essential to our time. We acknowledge that the genocide, theft of land and resources, forced migration, and systemic cultural oppression of Indigenous peoples and nations have a long-lasting impact on living conditions, mental health, and cultural lineage of Indigenous peoples and nations. We acknowledge that the colonizers and the descendants have benefited from economically and socially from the oppression of Indigenous peoples and nations. And we commit to repairing equity and rebalancing the power and distribution. Sorry for the noise in the background. As learners and educators, we recognize Indigenous peoples and nations' longtime traditions of making art and storytelling. We acknowledge the significance of their creativity and how often they are unrecognized as artists, designers, and writers. And while their culture is appropriated and taken by other artists, designers, and writers, only when we are informed of our past can we collectively envision our future. We begin by properly naming the land we reside on and recognizing ourselves as involuntary immigrants on this land. We will actively work to challenge the legacy of settler colonialism, undo its extractive, exploitive land practices, and express gratitude to the stewards of the land and water who came before us, and honor their descendants who are here today. And go ahead and take it on.
Thank you, Sydney. That was a beautiful introduction. Hi, everybody. My name is Michelle Sainer. I'm a student here at Pratt. And thank you, everyone, for coming to today's session. And thank you for our future listeners on YouTube. So before we start, I would like to preface this discussion with a brief framing. This is part 2 of a 3-part discussion series with a student-curated exhibition to be installed in Higgins by next week. So please stay tuned for that and for next week's conversation with Maya Bird Murphy on Thursday evening. And some of the topics we covered last week with our guest, Jess Myers, were around modes of architecture and covering sound as an architectural material. And so I'd like to continue that conversation and weave that in with this, both as a live event and something of an archive. And so with that, I'd like to once again iterate that this discussion was organized for and by students. So everyone feel free to drop comments, links, resources, and questions in the chat. During our Q&A session, please feel free to direct message me questions if you don't want to read them out loud yourself after the presentation. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker tonight. Julia Vanden Hout is an architectural designer. Julia Vanden Hout is an architecture and design writer, editor, and curator. She is the principal of Original Copy and architecture curator and program director at Art OMI. Prior to founding Original Copy, she was the press director at Stephen Hall Architects, and she was a founding editor of CLOG, an international publication that critically explores one topic at a time from as many perspectives as possible. Julia teaches at Pratt Institute's Graduate School of Architecture and is a member of the Exhibitions Committee at the Center for Architecture, AIA NY. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and Julia, please take us away.
Thank you so much, Sydney and Michelle and Jared. Let me share my screen. And okay, everybody can see it? Yes. All right. Well, thank you for having me speak tonight. I hope everybody had a chance to catch that first session in the series with Jess Myers. Check it out on YouTube if you haven't seen it yet. And I'm excited to join the series as the second speaker. The media of architecture. It's certainly core of what my practice is based on, And for me, more specifically, it is revolving around this question of how architecture is more than the built environment. How can we build outside of that in a meaningful way? I'm not trained as an architect. I work actually fairly exclusively within architecture, and I'm certainly incredibly passionate about architecture as a discipline, but have, quite frankly, never wanted to engage with it as a designer myself. To me, the driving interest has always been about how architecture intersects with the public, and under that umbrella, the question how we within architecture also communicate to the public. How do we present the value of this discipline? How do we listen to the role that architecture plays in a much larger societal, cultural, and ecological context? So I think an important added consideration to that is also the question of who is the public when we say that. And that's a question that has been, for me, really central, especially in the last few years. And I've been trying to broaden that definition for myself and for the work that I do. And considering how we determine who that public is, and I think we're often having selective conversations. We engage with who we want to engage with, but it's important to acknowledge that we can be exclusive, inclusive with that definition, and we can in that also be ambitious and unambitious in that definition of the public. So, okay. So to start, I just wanted to give you a little bit of background, and I suppose it's somewhat of a prologue to the work that I'll present to you tonight. I began my architecture career as a press director for an architecture firm. And for me, it was an opportunity to experience the day-to-day workings of an architecture firm, which I think has been really valuable to how I think, understanding the process of design and really being there to see that from start to finish. But always also from an outside perspective. So having that sense of somebody looking into the profession as well. And as press director, my task was to take the work of the firm and get it in front of as many people as possible. Hopefully, of course, some of those people are potential clients, new projects come from that. And then after a few years of working there, I went to grad school for architecture criticism. And being in that environment, which was very much focused on different modes of discourse, I co-founded CLOG. That was 2011. So CLOG is a quarterly journal at that time. I'll talk about it a little bit more in a moment. But for me, that was the first effort to take more of an active role in discourse. And while PR was about presenting to other people, there was no conversation in that. We weren't asking people to really engage with that. We were just asking them to publish the work as it was. So CLOG was born out of a want to engage, to test different strategies for hosting the larger conversation. After grad school, I decided that rather than going back to work in-house, I'm not on full screen presentation mode. Am I not?
Sorry to interrupt. Just
no,
so
it's
you know,
okay.
It's like you still have the thing. I wasn't sure if you were prefacing or not.
On my screen, I see it as full presenter. Let me retry so you get the full.
Okay, thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
No, it's okay.
Okay, thank you.
Is that any better?
You could try resharing, like stopping sharing and then resharing your screen.
Sorry about that, guys.
Looks good.
Yeah. Okay, we're in business. Okay. So after grad school, I decided that rather than going back to working in-house for a firm, I wanted to take the same model as Clog and do that on a different scale. So working with multiple people on multiple projects and across different media as well. So I founded Original Copy in 2014, and we work on publications, exhibitions, and some projects that fall somewhere in between those two. And then most recently, I've joined Art on My, which is a nonprofit arts organization in upstate New York, as their architecture curator and program director. And Art on My has a large property where they have a sculpture park as well as an architecture park. So it's been a great opportunity to work on actually commissioning installations and working at a very different scale than I have previously. Okay. So Clog was, as I mentioned, the first investigation into what I would call the media of architecture. And to be honest, Clog was born out of really a frustration with what the prevalent modes of communication are within architecture. It was founded by a team of 6, Kyle May, Jacob Rydell, Human Wu, Jeffrey Franklin, Archie Lee Coates, and myself. And we started having conversations about the way that we discuss architecture, mostly amongst ourselves within the profession. And I think most of us get our news online through any of the kind of international websites that publish projects. And I think it has been in many ways a really great development for architecture to be able to have access to an international collection of work. I think we're much more aware of what's happening all across the world. And in many ways, it's more democratic than print publications were in the past, especially. But it also works at a different rate. So whereas, you read one article, but within 5 minutes, it's been pushed down and it's been replaced by 10 news stories and then 20. So this quick turnover, we rarely have the opportunity to dive into any topic or any project. And I think also for architects, it's like you're so proud of this one project that you've completed, you see it out in the world, but nobody really engages with it. Nobody gives that sense of feedback. So we end up treating architecture really as a visual to be consumed, but it rarely gets into a deep conversation. We just skim the surface. So that's where we founded Clog. And this was our mission when we started, is very much the same today. It is the attempt to slow things down. So each issue explores from multiple viewpoints and through a variety of means, a single subject particularly relevant to architecture now. On paper, so always in print, really as an effort also to get away from this distraction, this quick moving distraction of the screen, and trying to get people to really engage with the kind of the accessibility of, on the one hand, the short form writing that the internet offers, and hopefully also an accessibility just to a wider public in that, but with the focus and depth of a longer form journal or book. So each issue is thematic and really bringing in multiple perspectives. So if on the left, we have the typical blog structure, you have one person tasked with publishing X number of articles each day. On the right is what we wanted to set up with Cog. Multiple people all writing about one given topic. So we identified a whole lot of subtopics and tried to make sure that we were showcasing this single topic as holistically as possible. So collectively kind of shaping how a reader engages with one topic at a time. We published, so far it's been 17 issues. This is just a few of them. And a new issue is coming very soon, actually. And we began, this was 2011, we began with a issue on Bjarke Ingels Group. And he had just established his firm in New York at that time, and bringing a new, very accessible approach to talking about his work. But what we noticed is that nobody had truly engaged with the work. Nobody was engaging with the rhetoric and his business model and diving into it. What we tried to do in that issue, and we carried through to a few subsequent issues, was also inviting a lot of people to write about his work and his firm, but then also offering him the opportunity to respond. So he was able to select any 10 pieces that he wanted, and we included in the back of the issue, we included his responses to those pieces. And we launched the issue also with a conversation event at Storefront for Art and Architecture. Our second issue was on Apple, looking at kind of the architecture and how the brand has used architecture. We did something similar on the Guggenheim. We did an issue on brutalism, which was one of our most popular issues. We did an issue on rendering, which I think was the most popular issue. And we did an issue on prisons, which I think to me was the most successful issue. And the writing in each of the issues was largely compiled through an open call system. This was how we tried to get as many different voices and really open it up to a international group, to anybody who wanted to publish. It did not have to be architects. In fact, we really tried to reach out and actively get people who were outside of architecture to contribute to these topics. And we always try to then also kind of identify what some of the subtopics were that maybe needed more of an expert opinion. So we also did some targeted outreach to certain authors to make sure that we had some key voices included as well. And I think this is why the prisons issue was one of the best, in my opinion, as much as I love all of the issues, was because this topic, central to that topic on prisons, was the question of, should architects engage with designing prisons, yes or no? And representing both sides of that argument got to the true core of what I think we wanted CLOG to be able to do as a platform. And for me, this was a moment that I could more clearly see the potential of these types of platforms, publications, exhibitions, to get both architects and non-architects to stop and think for a moment, to engage with the reality of how constructed spaces and the way we speak about them really impacts people on a day-to-day basis. So ultimately, our approach with CLOG was not so much to come at a topic with pre-established principles and set schemes, but try to distill original insights from the chosen works as they presented themselves to us. So really to offer a much more open-ended platform to the readers. And with that, on purpose, we abstained from presenting an overarching theory or an editorial motive that is intended to map or define any given topic, but really it is about a reader engaging with the issue, reading a whole lot of different perspectives, and hopefully through that being able to form their own opinion on a chosen subject. So this is actually, I just wanted to share this from the prisons issue. These are an example of some content that we did that was really from somebody who was directly engaged with the topic. These were drawings that we received from an inmate drawing their cell, because this is something that we could never share. This is a perspective that we can't offer. So being able to then give that to the readers and ourselves also learn from that, I think was to me an incredible opportunity, something that we often just otherwise don't engage with. And I think architecture decides and often not to engage with that. So to support our editorial aims, design was really important. to clog. And in maintaining this sense of accessibility, we want a clog to be small. So we made it a 8.5 by 5.5, just an 8.5 and by 11 folded in half, something that's really portable, soft cover. And the graphics were always very minimal. So you'll see that we always put the topic at the top, like a headline, and clog very small, even though most magazines would do it the other way around. For us, it was always about underlining this idea that content is what this is about. It's not about who is writing it. It's really about what's in it. And font choice, always important, and a way for us to kind of differentiate each issue and make them unique. So this is for the Apple issue, like taking some of the old ads, using that as the typeface for the issue, using the keyboard, and using that also as a secondary typeface within the issue. And then this is a pretty typical clog spread. So it has, the texts are limited to 500 words. That's kind of the longest text outside of interviews that were included. Small margins, trying to really maximize content as much as possible. On the left, either an image or a pull quote, and then the title and the author kind of at the bottom as footnotes again, because the idea that content is key, content is forward. And then in addition to the written pieces, we always had what we call research pieces. So whether it's like an analysis of the types of people that are included in renderings for the rendering issue, or comparing a minimum security cell to a maximum security cell for the prisons issue, or a very outrageously detailed timeline for our issue on Rem Koolhaas. These were the pieces that we as an editorial team contribute, and these are not put forth with kind of a summary takeaway, but more trying to tease out certain information about a topic so that a reader can form their own opinion. So original copy, just to switch over, as I mentioned, works on a variety of projects. Many do take a similar form to clog, a publication. We've produced publications of a range of scales and scopes, from small exhibition catalogs to hardcover monographs, from newspaper supplements to some academic publications, including some of Pratt's publications. And just to note that, of course, a big difference between clog and original copy work is that clog is a self-initiated publication. And we did that. We always tried to maintain that because we wanted to retain that sense of control and authorship over any decision, versus original copy that works for clients. But when I begin a new book for a client, my first question is always, why a book? Because I truly love books. I mean, you can tell I have plenty of them. But I want to always make sure that a book is really the right path to take, because a lot of times, especially if it's a monograph, why not just produce a website? What is it about kind of this format of a book that is important to this particular project? So, it could be a website, it could be a podcast, it could be a newspaper, it could be so many other things in a book. So really starting off a project by questioning the format has been really important to set the right path. And I think as many people are, I'm less interested in the book as a marketing tool and much more as the potential of a book to be a manifesto or a kind of a positioning statement. Architecture has such a long history of using publication as a driver of new ideas. It can definitely further discourse, and I think in many times has been used as a testing ground before testing things out in kind of in a built form. So I have much love for books. Outside of publications, we also have these kind of strange projects that fall in between. And one that I wanted to present today is New Local, which was, here you see the print collateral because there's always print collateral, but this was actually a 3-part symposium, a series of half-day long symposium called New Local, Finding Ground Within Global Uncertainty. And it's centered around an examination of what does locality mean today? We're in such a global situation. Everybody's always talking about globalization, but how does that impact kind of the local condition and how we interact with our direct context on a day-to-day basis? So with Corail Duman, Original Copy worked to curate this overall series of sessions, which brought together leaders from a variety of industries. So from architects to developers, planners, but also sociologists, policymakers, anthropologists. It was a wide range. And it was discussing each of these 3 symposiums was on a different topic. So we had a session on public space, one on living, and one on manufacturing. And the idea began with the public space section and questioning what is public space today and how do people feel ownership over their public space. But the more we started talking about it, these living and manufacturing also came up as important topics. So questions like how can we respond to emerging social contracts with new housing typology in cities in particular, and how does local manufacturing, how can that be resilient within the kind of a globalizing world? And ultimately, what should be or what should define emerging neighborhoods in a city like New York to create a diverse and equitable future? So we set up these 3 half-day long workshops and participatory talks. We worked with Arab for the public space talk. We worked with ADO on the housing talk, and we worked actually with Pratt's Fashion and Design Accelerator and the Center for Community Development for the manufacturing session. And each of these were centered around talks, presentation by a number of people. So there were a couple of talks throughout the day. And then, another important part of it was that we wanted to do these workshops in between. So it was an opportunity for the audience to actually sit down with some of the speakers. And we had a couple of exercises that we developed to try to get the conversation going, and then circling back at the end for each of these groups to then share their findings and talk much more as a group. So trying to really go from the presentation model to something that's more interactive and something that hopefully somebody walks away with feeling much more engaged in the topic and like we actually were productive about it. And then last, I wanted to share an exhibition as well. So 5 by 5 was a self-initiated exhibition from a couple of years ago. And the full title, 5 by 5 Participatory Provocations, which is a mouthful of a title, but it was kind of the effort to do exactly that, to be an instigator or to invite others to use this as a format to provoke. So we crafted the 5 themes that you see at the bottom here and invited then a group of 25 architects and designers to respond with small models. They were each limited in size to 12 by 12 by 12. So everybody was working within a similar envelope, but all doing their own interpretations of these topics. And looking back at our description of the show, we again began with this idea of the public. So we said, architecture as a profession struggles to simultaneously engage with the public and be provocative within the confines of its own field. Either arguments and proposals get dumbed down or they simply aren't accessible or relevant. So this idea of participatory criticism or provocation was centered around popular issues. So we had topics that we all face today. So the growing income gap, things like immigration, globalization, technology and how that impacts our daily life, surveillance, and power. And then each of these 5 topics was addressed by 5 different architects or designers, and working within that same kind of 12 by 12 by 12 format, but all coming at it with different ideas. So it had in the end 25 different models, and we began with a show at the University of Illinois, and in their architecture school. And this was, you can see, I mean, it was very much a low budget kind of self-initiated show. You know, we made these tables ourselves. We actually drove from venue to venue, packing it all up into a minivan. It went from University of Illinois, it went to RISD, also to the architecture school. And then it went to Art Omai, and this was before I came on as the architecture curator there, but it was the first instance of me actually becoming familiar with Art Omai. By far the most beautiful gallery space we had been to thus far, but also it was our first time that it was on view to a larger public. So while the first 2 or 3 had been at architecture schools or architecture related venues, this was a venue where people don't come for architecture. People come looking at art, but it's a real, and this is something I still am working with now within my position as curator at Art Omai, is this idea of how do you present architecture to a crowd that knows nothing about it, and that frankly thinks of architecture as a very defined thing. So how do you kind of broaden that definition for them? And I think this show was a nice first look at that. And then, yeah, and then we went to the Center for Architecture in New York. And here you see actually some of the models which dealt with a border wall were larger than the 12 by 12 by 12. But each of these kind of the very individualized responses to these larger topics. And then for this show, we also expanded with more research and kind of adding new detail to the topic. So I'll leave it at that, and happy to answer questions and excited to get into conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julia, for that wonderful presentation. We're going to transition into our Q&A portion. So I'm going to type a message in the chat, but if anyone wants to start getting the gears turning, or if anybody already has questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, to just unmute and ask away. And we'll be taking brief pauses, so you guys have the option to do so. And then when there's breaks, Sydney and I will continue asking questions. So I'm just going to pause for a moment and then start us off if no one else wants to. Okay, so I'll start us off. So Julia, you mentioned this consideration of the public a lot, right? And you said you've been asking yourself this question for the past like 1 to 2 years. And then also this means of broadening, right? You're trying to gather as many perspectives as possible for CLOG, right? It's almost like this anti-journalism in a way, because like you're flipping, right, the narrative with that awesome diagram that you showed. So I guess like for you, what does it mean to broaden, and how are you able to expand past your networks? How do you break that sort of pattern of like reaching out to, the select people that you are constantly in conversation with, and how do you kind of do that as someone who's on the inside of this publication?
I think that's always the biggest challenge. And I think that takes a lot of active work. For CLOG, that has always been a large part of our discussion, is how do we, we really love the architecture audience and appreciate their loyalty to CLOG as a platform and their willingness to engage with it. But also, how do we step outside of that? And that's really something where we have to push ourselves. So doing our research, trying to find who are the people, kind of the stakeholders outside of architecture who are really engaged and important to this conversation, reaching out to them, and inviting them into the conversation. So I think it takes a lot of work on our part. And that's the same thing for the books that I work on, trying to actively kind of pursue bringing in outside voices, and diving into topics that we are maybe not familiar with or not always comfortable talking about, but trying to see how can we bring that in. And because a lot of the books I work on, a lot of the exhibitions I work on they're ultimately still for an architecture audience. So it's also about bringing that and offering that to the architecture audience, allowing them the chance to engage with, voices from outside of architecture.
Since we're talking about, different perspectives, multiple audiences, for us, this also brought up kind of a translation of, and also accessibility, because it seems like at each level, there's a different type of translation and type of accessible language, not just between who you're open calling and collecting from, but also trying to portray to, which is the goal.
Yeah.
So how does that translation come into play in this work? Like, what is the, how do you begin to inform how you begin to choose or represent that? I guess a good example would be, especially in the prisons, as well as the last one, we're gathering 25 architects. And I see you didn't include that, but we was looking at the cover of the guns replication, where it was their barrel size. Well, their barrel size is their holes, but you wouldn't know that, but you know that because of the title, right? The metallicness of it. So it's like, how do you begin to navigate translating that?
Well, I mean, I think first of all, it's always been for CLOG, but also for the work that I've done as original copy. It's always been important to me as an editor to retain people's voice. I kind of described how with CLOG we've always tried to not impose an editorial objective as much outside of like the structure that we've set up for it. I think the same thing goes with editorial voice. It's like, of course, we edit things and we make it, make sure that it makes a point and kind of gets the message across very clearly, but also allowing people to really take their stance and use the words that they want to use and kind of retaining somebody's individual voice. I think that that's also definitely where design has come in. And I think where some of these, the research pieces that I described also are important, like being able to represent something graphically sometimes instead of using writing can be much more, it depends on the type of content. So it's always also a question of how do you communicate something best and how do you make a point most distinctly. It's part of why we chose for CLOG to really stick to 500 words or less of writing to kind of force something to a point. I think the longer form journals have kind of take that space to really dive into a topic, but often it also can be at the risk of somebody getting lost in the text. So we always like the idea of kind of the sense of directness and distilling something down to really its core to make sure that people engage with it. I think that throughout the project, I see that really as kind of the connecting line of my work with CLOG, and then also something that has continued into original copy and even comes through in the exhibitions, is like trying to bring people's voice through, allowing them to speak and not having this imposing kind of objective, not dictating that too much, and really also thinking about what format that takes.
So I guess with that, right, that parallels a lot for those of you who were able to listen to our last conversation with Jess Myers. We asked a really similar question about the different series in the podcast Here There Be Dragons. And she mentioned that, right, like she doesn't choose, like she doesn't know how many episodes are going to be in it, for example, like she doesn't know like what they're going to be called. So just sort of like a simpler question is like, how do you go about choosing your different, sorry, what are they called?
For clog, the different
Issues.
topics,
Yeah.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There's always been a running list of things that, I mean, it's also just been from an editorial team perspective, there's always multiple people involved. So, and really, when I say editorial team, I also mean the design team, because I think, again, like having those kind of voices that are coming from a design, like a graphic design perspective, also thinking about how this is represented, I think has always been really strong in CLOG. So everybody brings topics. Many people have suggested topics. There are some strict parameters that we've always set. And with kind of, you mentioned the gun issue, and that obviously is a topic where we stepped a little bit outside of architecture. So, I mean, that's also something of note, is that we've tried to use this platform now to also zoom out a bit and look at a little bit of a larger context. So that's another way that we've tried to engage that audience outside of architecture, to consider, can this same format work for something outside of that? But we always wanted it to be a topic that has that sense of relevancy, that has the multiple perspectives that can be presented. So it's not something where it is kind of a very straightforward topic where everybody agrees. It would be hard to find that topic anyway. But to try to find what are the topics that would benefit from somebody reading multiple points of view, and so it's often like a running list of topics, then also trying to identify within that topic what are the various subtopics. So when you look at a topic like guns, there is the gun as a design object, the gun as a sport, the gun as like a hunting tool, the gun as a political tool, societal, cultural, economic. There's a lot of different ways to look at this one object or one topic. That's always something we're looking for in the topics. And really making sure then from the beginning, also identifying who are the important voices that we want to make sure that, or the important points of view that we want to make sure are represented within that. And I think there have been amazing journals, by the way, that have set out like, we're doing 15 issues, these are the topics, and then they start. So they have like this really clear path outlined before they start. And I think it can be also incredibly strong to do that. With CLOG, we never did that. We considered it. We always specifically wanted to make sure, because we had this focus on it being a relevant topic at the time, to make sure that we were taking that in the moment. So there were topics that we talked about initially that we really wanted to do, but they just never really found their moment. And now it would be silly to do them.
And so, because, these different perspectives, we kind of want to move into, of course, graphically, how do you begin to represent them? So again, with some of these issues, like, do you mind going to either the first, like 35 or 11, whichever one, as far as representing like exhibition or an issue? It's interesting to see kind of the centered of the logo, the type of logo, as well as some of the color choices accompanied with the type of the name. And so we want to kind of discuss that materiality, because that can also, like, do you think of it in terms of, just since they are soft cover books, do you think of it in terms of what material they'd be placed on? How do you want to represent this material? Like, what goes into, of course, the aesthetics? We understand there's like a set margins and, type. There's fonts, probably different fonts for different things. As far as the overall aesthetic, when doing each one, there's a consistency, but they're also very different. Like,
yeah. For CLOG, yeah, design was always really front and center to our conversations about a topic. So obviously they were always consistent in size. There was also the placement that was always consistent of the title placement and the placement of CLOG and the center logo. So this, we had a lot of fun sometimes really deciding like what to do with that center sphere. it's impossible to show here, but each of those was actually, we had an embosser. So every one of these issues is hand embossed with the CLOG logo. Again, a very much a decision made to show kind of this slowness, the sense that each of these issues has been marked by one on our team, that it's not just like the printer prints them, gets delivered, and out it goes. Like each of them has been kind of gone through our hands. And then in terms of the type treatment, it was always very specific to a topic. So, you know, in Guggenheim, that's the Guggenheim logo or typeface. Let's see, in Landmark, going with something that's a serif font, so something a little bit more traditional. In Apple, using the Apple font. Same with the colors. You know, for brutalism, it's like a chipboard cover. So it tries to get, we can't do a concrete cover, but trying to get towards that materiality. Also inside, for some of them, for rendering, we chose a gloss paper to have a little bit more of that kind of visual feel to it. For World Trade Center, it was all black and white. So we've always tried to play with the inside and outside design of the issue to really fit with a theme. And I think that has allowed each of these issues to be very specific and tailored to the subject matter. I think that that's important to the experience that somebody has with it. I think the same thing goes for the exhibitions. There we're dealing with more physical parameters. So in the 5x5 show, it was very much about, from the beginning, the aim to set this up as a traveling exhibition. So we produced all the bases as, let's see, as tables, just like tabletops and legs that could fold flat. We used those for about 3 of the exhibits, and then for Art Omai, because it was a bigger space, we made new bases, but again, like using a format that these are all individual panels that can be flat packed. So because we were always traveling it, and we wanted to be really economic on how we were packing that up. So those things are, I think, important elements within the process of developing, also from a kind of conceptual standpoint. It's not something that's ever done after the fact. So with CLOG, it's that that discussion about design is very much running in parallel with us developing the content, the written content. And the same for the exhibitions, where the design and kind of graphic identity of these shows is very much happening at the beginning phases as we are developing the kind of what goes in the show in terms of kind of content, physical content.
Thank you. Yes, I kind of wanted to comment on that a little bit, on like this balance in terms of, right, consistency and difference in design, and then how that also operates, right, at an installation scale, where, you know, you have the pedestals as like this consistency. I just wanted to like tie in also Pratt Futures, because we had a conversation, at least at the beginning of this semester, maybe last semester, around like aesthetics, right? And like not having a singular person do our posters, but have it be like maybe a less consistent aesthetic. It's not as, I guess, direct. Like I know you guys have different fonts and typefacing, but it's still like that centered conversation. So ours maybe had a different intent, and yours is like more design heavy, right? But I guess maybe to, yeah, go ahead, please.
I was just going to say that, I mean, the same thing goes for the books that I do with original copy. I think that each of those has always had a graphic designer brought in really from an early moment. And that's always, I always kind of argue for that with a client, of the importance of having that a really early part of of the process, so that it's not like you write a whole book and then it goes to a designer to lay out, but that design is really integrated with the way you're thinking about the book from the beginning. So what I find myself being really interested in with a lot of these projects is like, what is the structure that supports kind of this then very tailored approach? So what is kind of the framework that we can set up that is the consistency that you need in order to then be able to work with a lot of differing type of material that you plug into it.
Okay, this one might be coming from left field, but I've been looking at the form follows feeling. Could you tell us a little bit about how the red on red, clearly, if that red is a gloss red on top, and then also, what is it like? I know, in architecture's form follows function, there's always the differing between two, but to say feelings that might spark something in professors.
Yeah, no, great question. Because actually that's one of the newest books I've worked on. So that's actually the newest addition to probably what is on this screen. This is a book documenting the work of Suchi Reddy, Ready Made, an amazing firm that you should all check out. And Suchi's mantra, really kind of her guiding statement is form follows feeling. So her work is very much focused on how spaces impact the way we feel. So how, like from a very kind of neuroscience perspective, how it is that they make us feel, how spaces really have the ability to impact us negatively and positively, and how obviously we should use that to create positive spaces for people to, and that goes on a range of levels, from residential work to institutional and space for healthcare, across the range. So she really wanted a square book from the beginning. We kind of talked about that square book, and this was designed by Pentagram. So, and they came up with like using that square that she really wants. It was an amazing, I think, a design that really took advantage of that. And the red on red being also, because it is an emboss with a gloss letter, like it has that sense of materiality into it. So you're really also engaging with it like through touch as much as it is from a visual perspective. So I think that's something that really runs through Suchi's work and really came nicely through the design by Pentagram.
Yeah, there's a lot of layers there. That's really great. I'm gonna pause for a moment just because I lost my place, but also if anyone wants to interject with another question, because you've been pretty back and forth.
I guess while Michelle is finding their place, could you talk a little bit about how you, like, I know a lot of it is group collective efforts with some of these books and things, but have there been times where you've rejected a topic to portray? Have there been times where you maybe think something wasn't being represented correctly?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, it's a lot about the consideration of what projects to take on. And that's kind of back to this idea of like, especially books can have just this marketing perspective. I think that that's not only just not that interesting, but I think also there's just, this is an opportunity to have that sense of engagement and to, I prefer to work on projects and try to work on projects that where this book or exhibition or whatever it ends up being is kind of the starting point of a conversation. And so also to think about what can happen after this book is out. I think coming at any project with a very clear sense of what the intention is and who it's for is important to discuss from the very early stages. There's books that I feel that maybe didn't turn out as strongly as I would have liked I think that's just the nature of it. And then there's books that I think worked really beautifully. And when I look at those just tend to be the projects that have really take a position and try to represent more than projects. So that try to engage in some kind of conversation or present research or something outside of just built work. And those are the types of projects that I want to take on. So it's been a range of work over the last few years, and yeah, I mean, looking at this kind of spread now, it's like it's kind of all over the place, but that's how I would summarize what at least the intent behind them is.
That's really beautiful. And I guess you speaking about, centering this reader, right, and it being the start of a conversation. I'm wondering just if you want to speak about how you see that conversation continuing, right? Whether it's, within the internal monologue of the reader, after they've experienced this, or, it being more directed towards informative for architects practicing, non-practicing, the architectural thinkers. How do you see this, or have you seen it start to inform the spaces and design of spaces, whether or not these issues are directly talking about built work or not?
I think these are not textbooks in any way. So it's about informing a reader, but it's very much also asking them to do the work, to engage and to think about it, and to do some of that work themselves and to continue to think about it. That's why I think for these types of books, it's also about somebody starting to think about what's important to them and putting that down on the page. And in a way, that's what I like about the book, is that as a format, it's kind of this defined thing. You have to at some point send it to print, so you have to make decisions about what's important, what's not important, define what it is and what it's not going to be. Whereas a website is this ever evolving thing, which has a lot of advantages, but also means that in some cases it allows people to kind of stay away from a real decision making process. In terms of I think some of the funnier parts have been when for Clog we did the let's see where it is. We did one of the research pieces for the rendering issue, which was looking at these kind of big name firms, and we spent a few of the team members from Clog spent a whole Sunday afternoon, I think, all going through all of the renderings for 10 most recent projects that these firms had, and looking at how some of the demographics broke down, and calling out some of the higher numbers, the lower numbers, and to really see how are we representing people that are using a space within these images that we put out as kind of marketing and announcement of these projects. So how are we idealizing? How are we representing it in an idealized version? And some of these things were kind of striking. But we did have some of these firms get back to us afterwards, kind of in shock of this is, not great to see, but it is very informative to actually see how we are, how we're representing our projects and who the user is. So that's the hope, that they would take something like this and actually think about it more next time and try to consider what is the message that we're putting out into the world when we're producing these renderings and showcasing who this project is for. But I also think even for the book projects, even if that's a conversation starter where you say, you publish a book, it allows you to engage with different people. You're actually actively seeking out those conversations, putting them in print, and then hopefully using that as a springboard for further research that you're doing or for further conversations that you're hosting. I think that's the potential that these types of projects have. And not everybody engages with it that way, but at least that's an aim.
That's awesome. And I guess like reflecting on how you have narrated that like decision making, right? Like sending to print, putting things down on paper. I think we've all sort of had like a break from that with everything switching to virtual, right? And this idea that you don't really have to make decisions because things can just constantly get updated and keep changing, right? Like keep the submission form on and everything keeps rolling in and changing. And so that kind of comes to like where we are right now in this conversation, right? This is something to be archived that's part of this continued discussion that we can actually just rewatch and rewatch over again. So that's just sort of a little meta throwing in there. I don't really have a direct question that goes to that, but I just sort of wanted to say that.
That's both a frightening thought and a great thought. You know, I think that's these are all things that we should learn from and continue to analyze. So it's not like these singular moments, because I think there's a lot of learning that we can do from the initiatives that people are, the exhibitions that people are doing, the publications that people are doing, the lectures that people are hosting. So having that live online actually is also just allowing it to live on and for it to be much more accessible than, especially what's happening in academic environments, to allow that to be a larger discussion for anybody to access, I think is, it's a really wonderful thing.
Yeah, right. It's this opening conversation like within education, right?
Yeah.
It's like this like aperture that you can like then invite like your brothers or your family to go watch it, which is sort of exciting and also really weird at the same time. But around that, I have a question around like participation, right? You at first sort of framed this as like a participatory way, right, for architects to start thinking about like a lot of different perspectives that maybe not everybody has considered for their entire life or during their education. Like this is a very gate-kept profession, and that you like have informal like architecture, hard like capital A architecture education, right? And so like I'm just curious how this this influences your many practices that you participate in, right? Like not as a licensed or like you formally trained architect, and if you have any reflections on your experience sort of coming into this realm, right? Because it's a very like almost closed circle space, but you're able to really get out of that. So if you have any reflections on that.
I always saw it as a plus, or at least for the work that I do within architecture. Having that outside perspective, I think, has actually always served me well, because I've seen that as part of my job, is to kind of consider how this reaches a public. I've worked in places where it felt quite divided between architects and non-architects, in not a positive way. But I do think that it takes, architecture is not just, as a discipline, is not just about design. It's not just about the people actually working in practice. So it is really important to consider all that architecture is on a much larger scale, and especially because architecture always ends up impacting people that are very much outside of architecture as a profession. So I think it's really important to be able to consider that and to be able to present architecture and think about architecture from a much larger perspective. You know, I think it's a lot of what happens in academia is very important in pushing forward architecture as a discipline, and what happens in practice is incredibly important, but also kind of that interaction with people outside, and with the people that are actually using spaces is incredibly important. And I mean, this is something that I speak with my students about all the time, is like, how do you explain architecture to somebody who's outside of architecture? And I think about things like, how do I explain it to my family? How do I talk to, how do I really get to the core of a project in a very kind of everyday type of experience, and kind of translate that idea, because we have ways within architecture of speaking about it. We have terminology that we use, but often I think we don't think about what those words actually mean. You know, we talk about community, we talk about inclusivity, but they're thrown in there without much consideration of what we're actually implying, and whether that's actually truthful. It becomes all part of the marketing. So thinking about that in a more true way, I think it's difficult, but I think it's part of the process that's important to consider.
I really love how you think about design. To me, it seems more than, of course, just down to pen to paper and sending out. There's so much, again, as Michelle answered, like layers to this to like relay information. Translation is also a big part of architecture and designing, how people read it. And I guess to like not be as strict, a question I'm curious about, what so far has been your most rewarding project that you feel like everything clicked, right? When you started finally getting to what's defining your profession for yourself?
I think Clog has been an incredibly rewarding thing in that. But I am definitely aware of the fact that this is almost like a bit of a luxury that that's something that we've been able to do on a self-initiated basis. And that has always been kind of self-sustaining, like whatever issues get sold immediately, that money goes into printing the next issue. And that has really relied on a team of all of us kind of doing that for free, which is, of course, like that's more of a luxury position to be in. I think in terms of the books, I've increasingly been able to work on books where really it is bringing in a lot of outside voices. So let's see. I think this book is a book that I did recently, which is with PLP. They're a London-based architecture firm. And I mean, this shows all the different people that wrote for the book. So it was a book presenting work by an office, but it was very much in the context of a larger picture of, especially looking at the last 10 years, kind of from the recession to now, and what are the things that we can learn from those 10 years that are just like, if we consider these as cyclical events that happen, how do we learn from kind of the last 10 years in order to be more resilient for the next 10 years. Of course, the pandemic is like a great example of that. How can we actually look back at some of those emergency responses and think about how architecture can play a role in building greater resilience for that to come? And that relies on people, on bringing in outside voices to help think about that. So those have been, for me, the really kind of valuable experience to work on, also because from just a selfless perspective, I feel like I learned with each of these books that I work on and the exhibitions I work on. It's just an opportunity to do kind of a deep dive into new topics. So those have been nice moments where it's a lot of people come together to consider how best to present something, how best to compile knowledge and sharing that.
So I guess you, like, speaking to all the layers of, education, conversation with your students, right? Like, these practices are informing each other throughout your life, right? And all of these opportunities that you got to get, like with publication, right? And working like on feeding on the next, and having that. I guess I'm curious about what you consider yourself within architecture. Like, do you consider yourself a curator, or are you also an artist, or like just for you?
Sometimes I wish I felt like I had like a single job title. It would be so much easier. Certainly, I think my family doesn't always understand what to, say that I do to other people. I don't know. The shorthand answer is like, I would say I'm a editor and curator, but I think the nicer moments fall somewhere in between all of that. I think a lot of these types of projects, the same goes for design projects, but I think with a lot of these projects, we have just the ability to kind of instigate and facilitate, and that those are the most rewarding moments. It can be small, it can be large, but somewhere, as long as each of these projects can have some element of that, or at least an ambition of that. And I think that there's a lot of amazing firms doing that from a design perspective, through actual projects and working with policymakers and with city officials to really try to make change through much more of a design and community engagement. So I think that there's a lot of great work that happens across platforms that that's really like immensely notable.
And I guess if nobody has any more questions, this will be our last question to kind of wrap up everything. But we were very curious about not only yourself and how you stand and position yourself as these multiple titles, but also let's focus on like the one title as an educator, because it's amazing that you talk about original copy, everything across platforms, collaborative, participatory work, everything, but then you also have students. And when you're going about showing them your work, maybe, as well as maybe navigating them through their own work, like how has that been as a designer and curator and teacher?
So I right now I'm teaching in the GAUD in the graduate school, a research seminar that is, the thesis students have to produce a book as part of their degree requirements, and that is based on the research that they're doing for their studio project, and that also really documents the 3 semesters of work that they have. It's been a really great course to teach because it does get to the core of a lot of this. It's like about them really working with the research that they have, trying to take a position. It involves a lot of them doing precedent research, seeking out the people that they want to talk to, people that have done work that is relevant, trying to use that as an opportunity for them to talk to people and kind of step outside of their work in order to investigate what is the larger kind of disciplinary position that this fits within. So it's about them really thinking about what are also the arguments that other people have put forth through writing, through design, through research, and assessing where they align or do not align with that. So, and then also thinking about how do you represent that in a book format? So all of them are producing their thesis books, designing them, working with their own project, as well as reference projects, kinds of precedence projects, and designing like the structure for that, how they're building up their argument. They write a manifesto as part of that, like a design manifesto. So it has been for me a really nice way of like a nice project that hits a lot of the things that are the work, like active in the work that I do myself. And I think that the beautiful thing is that they graduate with kind of this document of their own interests, and they really then hopefully graduate with something like really knowing clearly what it is that they want to take forward after graduation.
Thank you. Thank you. You go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I was gonna say, yeah, thank you so much. And that, like, I feel like it just like circles back, right? Like Sydney and I are both in degree projects for undergrad, and so we're like going through similar cycles with the research and then production and a lot of reflection in that. So it just takes us all the way back. So thank you for that.
I think it's not always in that moment perhaps what you want to work on, but it is I think a really good process to go through. And again, like being forced to put things on paper and kind of lock them in and at some point say that this is done. And then maybe 5 years from now, you look at that and you think, what was I thinking? But at least like it is a document that you take with you and that allows you to kind of on a very personal level position the work you have been doing and that you want to be doing.
Yeah, and that also ties back to kind of what Jess said last week with this like first season where she was like, I'm not embarrassed at my first take, right?
Yeah.
Like I'm still gonna have that. So like even having that to reflect on, but in a longer term. So
Yeah.
that was really beautiful. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah, I guess Julie, if you have any like last remarks, I guess we're gonna start to close out.
Okay. No, thank you so much. It's always great to talk about these types of works. And I think that the questions you asked really get to the core of the potential of some of these other platforms outside of kind of built work and kind of the academic conversations, but how those also interact with a larger public. So I think it's been also always really nice for me to think about that and be reminded of what the core is of the work that I do and how a lot of these types of projects that also a lot of others are engaging with that have real potential. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Sid. I was gonna mention no. I was
Our
just gonna say that
exhibition.
this conversation will be continued next week with our last sort of discussion series, and also physically as an installation in Higgins, right, with student work. So thank you, Julia, so much for being a critical part of this conversation and coming out tonight. And thank you, everybody, here listening in, and everybody on YouTube in the future. If you didn't miss it yet, I'll be closing in a minute. So yeah, thank you, everybody. Have a great night.